Hey everyone, my name is Wes, and in this video we'll take a look at how to build an Angular 4 application to query public-facing APIs as well as implement Google's Material design. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's take a look at the application we'll be building in this video. So we're essentially going to build an image search app that is going to query Pixabay's public-facing API for some image data. So Pixabay hosts a fairly large number of images that are in the public domain. So let's say I want to find images of Holland, for instance. So I type Holland in here and click Find Images. And in return, I get a set of those images posted back by Pixabay, as well as the tags that each of the images are tagged with, the number of comments and likes, and the user who uploaded the image. So that's pretty cool. You'll notice that as we make queries here, that they're actually posted asynchronously. So the page doesn't need to actually reload. It's just this gallery component that is getting refreshed. You'll also notice the way that the cards are kind of stacking here is nice and tight, and that's due to a library called Masonry. So that's pretty nice. You'll notice that as we resize the DOM here as well, the images kind of stack and restack so that we stay responsive. We're also implementing the, at least in some respect, the Google Material design paradigm, which is providing us with the look of a lot of the elements in the DOM here. So you also notice that when we click on an image, it will actually take us over to the Pixabay website where we could download the image in high res if we like. So let's go ahead and see what it's going to take to get this thing wired up. So I'm just going to create a new directory to hold our project, and we'll call it image search. I'm using the Commander terminal emulator here if you are wondering, and cd into the new directory you made. And then I'm going to use the Angular CLI tool to generate our project. So for that, we just type ng new, and we'll call it the same thing. So if you're not familiar with the Angular CLI, I will post a link to a previous video I made where I covered that in a little bit more detail. But essentially it is a tool that we can use to generate everything from Angular components and services and pipes and things like that. But it's also useful for scaffolding out a new project because, as you can see, it will create a whole bunch of files for us and basically get it up and running very quickly. So once this is complete, I will continue. Okay, so once the CLI has generated our project, you should see this success message here. And now we can actually just cd into the new directory it's made. And if we take a look at the contents of this directory, we can see that it's created a whole host of files here, and it's also instantiated a Git repository for us, which is kind of nice. So our Angular project will actually work now, and we can take a look if we once again use the CLI to spin up a development server with ng-serve. And what this is going to do is it's going to spin up a little server locally at port 4200, and it's actually going to listen as we make changes to our code, and each time we save a file, that server is going to refresh, which is kind of nice for debugging and checking out our application very quickly. So you can see that everything's compiled as expected, and now I'll just open up an instance of Chrome and head over to localhost at port 4200, and we can see that our application is working. Alright, so far so good. Now let's go take a look at the code. So for this particular project, I'm just going to use the Atom editor. And so I've got the root directory of the project open here in my project pane. And the first thing that we'll take a look at inside the source directory here is the index.html file. And you can see that the CLI has created some boilerplate HTML for us. We've got a base href, we've got the title of our application, and inside the body tags we have a pair of app root tags. So everything that's happening in our Angular application is going to happen here. And so this app root component we can take a look at if we head over into the app directory which is under source. And the three files here, the app.component files, the CSS, HTML, and TypeScript files, we can take a look at. Notice also that the CLI generated a spec file for us. We won't be covering testing in this video, but it is useful to know that the CLI generates the spec files for us as well. So let's take a look at app.component.ts. And we've got a very simple sort of base component here with the component decorator, which is getting imported from Angular core module, and the selector is going to be app root, as we saw on the index.html page, and we can see the template URL and styles URLs properties here, which correspond to the other folders in this app directory. All right, the class that we're exporting is called app component, and it has a single property called title, which is currently equal to appworks. So we can see that that's actually what's getting put out on the page here. And we can see that if we head into the app.component.html file, we have a pair of h1 tags here with the title property, which is getting interpolated here. So if we head back into app.component.ts and we change our title to the name of our application, which in this case, you can name it whatever you want. I'll just call mine Pixabay image search. And if we save it, head back over into our browser, and we can see that the title is getting output here. So we know that that's wired up correctly. So what I'd like to do now is create a new component that we'll use to actually display the images that get returned when we make our call to the API. So we'll head back into the code, and in the app directory here, let's go ahead and create a new folder, and we'll call it image list. Now, in a previous video, I showed that you can just create your CSS, HTML, and TypeScript files manually, but I'd also like to show you that the CLI can do this as well, and it's a little bit faster. So if we head back into the command line, I'm just going to stop the development server temporarily. And the command that we're going to use to create a component using the CLI is ng generate component image list. And so you can see that it's created actually 4 files for us. It's created the CSS, HTML spec file and TypeScript file for this component. We are not going to actually cover any testing in this particular video, but it is nice to know that the CLI will create spec files for us, and it's also updated our app.module.typescript file. So let's go take a look. So inside our image list directory now, we can see that the CLI created those 4 files for us. And we can also note that in our app.module.typescript file, you can see that it's also added the import statement here to import this image list component that it's created, as well as add it to our array of declarations in the ng module decorator here. All right, so let's go take a look at the TypeScript file that it generated at imagelist.component.ts. So we can see that this is sort of like just a bare bones Angular component. It's importing component and on init from the Angular module. And we have our component decorator here. The selector, the CLI prefixes everything with app hyphen. I guess if I was making it myself, I'd probably just make it be called image list. I think that's readable enough, but we'll leave it as app image list for now. It's pointing also to the template that it created as well as the styles. So that's just these files here, over here under the image list directory. Okay, so we're exporting the image list component class, and by default it's implementing this on init interface, which we've imported here. This isn't really going to be necessary for our application, but it's also not hurting anything, and it's kind of a nice interface to implement, I guess, because, well, it's going to require us to create an ng-on-init method inside this class, but this is going to fire anytime a new instance of this class is generated, so it can be useful in a lot of cases. Okay, so if we think about our application and what we want it to do, we basically have this set of image objects that comes back from our API call that we make. So inside of this class image list component, I'm going to create property images, and we're going to say that that can be an array of anything. So we're going to use that to store those images when they come back. And then inside our constructor here, what I'm going to do is actually, we're going to inject a service. So it'll look something like this. We'll inject a private image service, which has to be of type image service, which we haven't created yet, but we will in just a minute. And then we know we're going to have to import that here, so I'm just going to copy this import statement. And we're going to put our service inside a shared directory. And we'll create that in just a minute, but this is going to be the relative path. Okay, and we can use the CLI to actually generate the service as well, similar to the way we did a component, but it's also easy enough in this case just to do it manually. So under app, I'm going to create a new folder, and this will be our shared folder. And then in here we'll create a new file, and we're going to call it image.service.ts. Alright, so this is going to be a typical Angular 2 service or Angular 4 service. And so what we need to do is import injectable from at Angular core. And so let's go ahead and just create our class. So we're going to export it and call it image service. All right, and we need to decorate it with our injectable decorator. Okay, so inside this service, we're going to define a couple of methods that we're going to use to actually make our API calls. So we will define some properties inside this class. Make one called query, and it's going to be of type string. All right, now I want to make a couple of properties to store our API key and the URL. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, but let's go ahead, make our API URL of type string. All right, we'll just leave it at that for the moment. And so in order to make queries against the Pixabay API, you're going to need to sign up for an account there. So let's go take a look at the Pixabay website. And what you'll need to do is either log in or sign up if you haven't signed up yet. All of this is going to be completely free. So we'll go ahead and sign in here. And then if you look down at the footer on this page, you can see a link to the API. So we'll click that. And you should read the documentation here. You'll notice that they request that you provide a link back to Pixabay if you create an application with their API, and also that you show your users where the images and videos are from whenever you display any results. So go ahead and read this documentation. You'll also see a little bit about the rate limit that's provided with this free version of this API, and you'll get some information about the endpoints that you have. All right, on the first row here, you will see your API key. So this is something that you obviously don't want to share with anyone. You shouldn't really check this into source control, obviously, but it is going to be something that we will need to authenticate our requests. So what you're going to want to do is just copy this, and you can store this as an environment variable on your particular environment. We're just going to actually store it inside an environment folder in our project. So in the source directory here, you'll notice that we have a folder called environments. So if we open that up and then we open up the environment.ts file, you can see that this was built by the CLI, and we just have this environment object which has a production property set to false. What we'll do now is we are going to add our API key here. And then below this, we'll also create something called our Pixabay API URL. And this is just going to be the URL to the Pixabay API. Now, if we head back over into our image service, what we can do is we can set these here. And so the first thing we need to do is actually import that environment file. So what we'll do is import environment from, and then that's a few directories up from here, and it's under environments, environment. And then what we can do is, and so we'll set our URL and our key here just like that. And that's nice because we can then check the service into source control, and this file can get passed around, but we don't need to pass around the API key or the URL to the Pixabay API. Alright, so we'll be making HTTP requests to this Pixabay API. So luckily Angular has an HTTP class built in that we can import, and it makes everything pretty straightforward. So we'll import HTTP and headers from Angular HTTP. And then the way that this is going to work is inside of our image service class, we'll create its constructor, and we're actually going to inject an instance of HTTP here. Alright, so HTTP is an injectable class, and it basically has methods on it that will perform our HTTP requests. So you'll recognize the methods on it as your standard HTTP verbs like get, post, put, patch, delete, etc. And so as we'll see, when we make something like a GET request, what we'll get in return is something called an observable. And I won't get into a whole lot of detail about observables in this particular video, but it is basically a collection that arrives over time. So it's very useful for sort of like streaming events and asynchronous requests. What's important is that we can use a map operator on our response to basically work with whatever response comes back whenever it's ready to come back. So let's take a look at how we would do that. So we need to import rxjs add operator map so that we can call the map function here on the observable that gets returned by our HTTP GET method. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a method called getImage, to which we'll pass our query. And getImage is going to return, we're going to use this .http. So we're going to use this injected HTTP class, which has a get method on it. And we're going to pass get our query in a minute here, but then we're going to call .map on the observable that gets returned, and we're going to write a little lambda here which maps the result to JSON. Okay, so what are we going to pass into .get here? Well, let's go ahead and create another variable called URL. You can refer to the Pixabay API docs if you'd like to see the URL structure for whatever type of query you'd like to write. In this case, ours is going to look like this. We're just going to have this URL variable here, and it is going to be a combination of the API URL plus our API key plus our little query string here, which is just the &q equals. And so then down in our get method, we simply pass in the URL plus our query. And I'm going to add one more thing here. I'm going to store this as a variable. This is a little sloppy, but by default, the Pixabay API currently returns, I think it's 20 images, and I'm just going to limit that down to 10. Alright, so that's a little sloppy. Maybe you'd want to overload getImage with, say, the query and then the number of results that you'd like to return. In this case, I'm just going to hard code it like that, but that should work. Okay, awesome. Before we forget, let's go ahead and register our service, our image service here in our app.module. And so we just need to copy that, and this is going to be called our image service from shared image.service. Okay, we'll go ahead and save that, and then we need to make sure that it's in our list of providers. Okay, cool. Now we can head back over into our image list component and use our image service that we've injected here. And so what we can do is we can create a method called, say, search images, which will pass our query, which has to be of type string. And what we'll do is we'll just return this. We'll use our image service, which we can now call getImageOn. And we're going to pass our query, the same query that we are passing into search images here. And then that's going to return our observable, and now we can call .subscribe. And we can pass in an argument data, which for now we'll just log out to the console. If we happen to get an error back for some reason, we'll go ahead and log that as well. And finally, we can just call an anonymous function here, and this is just going to fire whenever this event is complete. So with that kind of wired up, let's go ahead and just do a quick smoke test. Okay, I can see I have an error here. It looks like that we can't resolve images.service. So that looks like a typo. I think that should be image service. So in our image list component.typescript file, we need to import image.service. Okay, let's see if that fixed the issue. Alright, that looks good. And now if we go back to our page, okay, so it doesn't look like anything's broken. Now let's go ahead and wire up a button here that we can use just to kind of smoke test our API call and make sure that that's working. So I'll go back into image list component.html, and what we'll do is just we'll get rid of this paragraph tag, and we'll just create a button here, and we'll create a click event that's going to call our search images function that's on this component. And for our search query, we'll just pass in like just some static value for now. So say New York, find images. Okay, so our component template is just a simple button for now. And now we'll head into our app component HTML, and underneath our title here, we'll use the tag for our app image list. Okay, let's check it out. Alright, so we have our button here, and when we click it, you can see we get a request complete is fired, and we get the object actually returned to the console here as we had set it up. So you can see that on this object we have this hits array, and we're getting 10 objects back. The index starts at 0 here. And then each of these objects contains some data about each of the images that were returned, corresponding to, in this case, the query New York. So the next thing that we want to do is to use some of this data that gets passed back into our application in a more meaningful way than just logging it to the console. So let's go back into our app. So let's go back into our component template and get some of that worked out. So I'll head over into imagelistcomponent.html, and right now obviously we just have this button which is passing this static string here, New York, into our search images function. What I'll do instead here is we'll pass it something we'll call search query, And I'm going to give this button a type button. And then just above it, what I'll do is we'll create an input. And it'll just be a simple text input, but we'll use what's input into that field to pass in this value of search query on our click event that's wired up to this button. So I'll give it a class of search, and we'll style that up in just a moment. And for that, I can use this ng model syntax, and we'll call what's in here our search query. I'll give it a placeholder value, and let's see what that looks like. All right, so now when we type something in here, so let's type in something else, so like Toronto, for instance. Find images. Our request is complete, and we get a new set of images back. And so let's check it out. So yeah, you can see that the URLs coming back have to do with Toronto. So let's do something really simple, and we'll just create an ng4 directive, and we'll use that to iterate through this list of objects that we get back from our API call. And then we'll just put, say, an image tag, and we'll just display them out as a list on the page to start before we get into styling everything. So I'll head back into our HTML here. And for now, we'll just go ahead and create a div. And on this div, we will star ng4. And we'll say let image of images. We'll give this a class of image container, which we can style later. And then inside this div, we'll create a handful of paragraph tags here. Oops. We will use some of the properties that are on each of these image objects. So we've got tags, comments. If you want to explore other properties that are on this object, you can just go back to the browser and check out what we logged to the console. So for instance, we just did Toronto. You'll see in our hits array here, for each object, we've got a bunch of metadata here. So you can see the user, the type, tags, all of this stuff is accessible to you on the image object in our collection. So if you recall, images is a property that's on our component here, but currently it's just an empty array. So let's actually wire it up so that the response we get doesn't just log to the console, but that it populates this images array with the hits array that gets returned when we make a request. So our images should be this hits array that contains 10 image objects. So for that, we've got to go back into our image list component.ts file. And you can see that when we're successful here, we are just logging the data that gets posted back to the console. What I'd like to do instead is to write a separate method called handle success. So we'll handle success. We're still obviously going to pass it the data. Oops, handle success. And so let's go ahead and write that up here. So handle success is going to take data. We can first of all still call console.log. If you notice when we logged our data, that the images were contained in an array called hits. So we'll just log that. We'll log data.hits. But in addition to that, we want to assign images to data.hits as well. So this.images is equal to data.hits. So the hits array that came back from our API request will now get assigned to this images array that we created earlier. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create an images found Boolean, and we'll default it to false. We'll switch that to true when our handle success method gets called. So that looks good. The next thing that we'll do is we'll create a handle error method, And in the case of an error, we will just log that error. If you are writing a more robust application, then you would certainly want to do more elegant handling of any errors that came back by giving the user some actual feedback on the page, but for our purposes, just logging them to the console should suffice. And so we will call handle error here. And we have to remember to call this because it is on our class. Okay, so now when the request is successful, we should be assigning our images array to the data.hits array that comes back from the API call. And on our template, we are implementing that just in some paragraph tags here so that we can kind of see what that looks like. Oops, and I want to fix what gets passed to handle error here to error. And I'll also fix this typo. And that looks good, so let's take a look. Okay, so let's put in our search term here. And we'll type New York back into the search bar, find images, and you can see now on the page we are getting some data back. Does not look like tags are getting output. So let's check. We can confirm that tags do exist on these objects. So let's take a look at what's happening. I'll head back into my template, and just another typo here, we need to call image.tags. So I'll save that and we'll go back to the page. Find images, and now our tags are showing up, so that's looking pretty good. Okay, so now if I want to actually display images on the page, then I can just create an image tag, and for the image source we will just use this web format URL parameter that's coming back on each of these objects. So let's do that. So we'll go back into our template. At the top of our div that contains the ng4 directive, we'll put an image. And it's as simple as using interpolation to apply our image.web format URL on this image tag. Alright, so let's save that and take a look at the page. So we'll search for New York again. And you can see that the images are coming back. So that's looking pretty good. Note also that the API by default should cache the images that are coming back. So let's say I search for something that I haven't searched for yet. So say like Delhi, and we click find images. Notice that it takes a little bit longer to pull those images back. Whereas if I type New York in again and click find images, they come back instantly, and that's because they've been cached. So just something to keep in mind. So with that in mind, what if we wanted to provide the user with some feedback that the API call was in process and that the page was still loading? So we could display like a loading message or a loading bar on the page while that call was being made that would then disappear when the images came back. So let's look at how we would do that. So if we go back to our code and we go back into our ImageList component.typescript file, we could create another bool here that we'll call searching, and we'll type it as a boolean, and by default we'll set this to equal to false. Then down in our search images method, we can assign that searching to true. And again, it's got to be this.searching. And instead of just logging that the request is complete here, we'll turn searching back to false. Okay, cool. So now how are we going to implement this on the page so that we provide the user with some feedback? Let's go back into the template. For now, we'll just create a new paragraph tag, and we'll apply the ngIf directive to this tag, and we'll set that to be searching. Just close that, and we'll just say for now fetching data. Alright, so in a few minutes when we apply the Material UI elements to this page, we'll replace this with a progress bar. But for now, this should be enough just to make sure that everything's working. So if we go back to our page So let's say Nevada. You can see fetching data appeared just for a moment there while the request was being sent. So that's looking good, and we can use it in more elaborate ways if we need to when we have a little bit more of a complex UI developed. So let's go back to the command line for the moment, and we'll go ahead and stop the server, and we're going to install some new dependencies here. And the first thing that we'll install is the Material UI. So we can install that with npm install --save at Angular/material. So we'll let that install in the project. So it's going to help us kind of make our app look nice without too much effort. So the next couple of things that we'll install here are Bootstrap, and we'll install the Angular Masonry package, which is Angular 2 Masonry. So Masonry is what's going to give us that nice responsive feel to our set of images when we display them in a group on the page. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and start the server back up. And we'll be sure that everything is working correctly still. So if we just make sure we reload the page, type in our search query again, and nothing is broken since we installed some new libraries, so that's good. Now we'll head back to the code, and I'm going to add some CSS here. So we'll go into our imageless component.css, and for now I'm just going to paste some CSS, and you can pause the video and recreate it if you like, or you could find the code on GitHub in the description below, or of course you could style it yourself and add your own sort of styling to this page. But I'm going to paste it in chunks here, and then like I said, you can pause the video or grab the code from GitHub. Alright. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the CSS on this component. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to head back into our imageless component template. And it's sort of the same thing here. I'm going to replace what we have in here. Okay, so if we take a look at what's happening in this file now, we've got these tags that say things like MD card, MD input container, etc. So this is coming from the material design library that we installed. So it's kind of providing these components for us that are going to create these DOM elements in the style of the material design. So we've got cards and input containers. If you'd like to see a full list of what elements are exposed by that library, then you can head over to material.angular.io and click on components, and you'll see, for instance, say buttons, indicators, and icons. Let's take a look at, say, a button with some examples here, and you can take a look at the code here as well. They've got a GitHub, and I'm sure you could explore that and find more information about that as well. So yeah, you can see in the docs, you'll be able to see all the different types of features that are available. Next, we need to go back into our app.module.ts file, and we need to import some of those modules that we just brought in. So we'll import material module from Angular Material, and we'll import the Masonry module from Angular 2 Masonry. Don't forget to add everything to your imports array here. The other thing that we should add here is the browser animations module as well. I'll go ahead and we'll just add that to our imports list as well. It's going to be Angular Platform Browser Animations. And for the animations, we actually need to head back to the command line here and run npm install save Angular animations. So with those new dependencies installed, let's go ahead and start our server back up. Okay, everything compiled. So if we take a look at our page, we can see that it's starting to look a little bit better. We've got a search bar here that looks like it's working, and our Find Images button is looking a little bit better as well. So next, I want to import some Google fonts. So let's go ahead and do that. If you head over to probably fonts.google.com, and for this particular app, I'm going to use a font called Fredoka 1. So we'll add that, and once we have that selected, we can just copy the embed link and we'll paste that in our index.html. So I'll just go ahead and paste that in the head tag here. The next thing that I'm going to do is revisit our app.component files. And if we take a look at app.component.css, I'm just going to paste in some styles here. Once again, feel free to copy this verbatim or take a look at the code in the link below, or just write your own, whatever you like. So that looks good. I'm just going to save that file. And then in the app.component.html, I'm just going to remove what we have here and paste in the complete HTML. Alright, so you'll notice that towards the top of the page, I am linking to Pixabay as well as providing their logo. If you look back at their API page, in the documentation, you'll notice that they request that if you make use of the API to just credit where the images are coming from and that you may use their logo for this purpose. So you can just go here and you can download a PNG file of their logo. I just then drop that in a directory that I created called assets. Well, it's already created for you, but I created an image directory inside here. So just create one called image, and then I'll just drag and drop the logo file I downloaded into that directory. And this is just the relative path to that PNG file that's in the image directory here. So I'll go ahead and save this file. And now for our last bit of styling for now, we'll head into the styles.css, which is where we can place our global styles. This is located in the source directory, and it should be at the same level as your index.html page. So I'm going to copy and paste once again here, and we'll take a look. This import statement here we can use to import some pre-built themes in our Angular Material library. Take a look at their documentation if you'd like more information about that. And then all I've done here is applied a gradient to give the background of the page a kind of a nice look. So if we take a look, this is what the page is currently looking like. Alright, so we also need to add one more thing to our index.html file. And this is just going to be a link to a JavaScript package called images loaded. And so I'll scroll out a bit so you can see the full URL here. And what this is useful for is if we go back into our imageless component.html, on our masonry tag here, we can apply this use images loaded equals true. And this was actually helping me solve an issue I had where the masonry bricks would overlap each other when I made asynchronous calls out and updated the DOM, you know, with like without refreshing the page. They wouldn't draw properly, but after adding this use images loaded here in the masonry directory, everything worked much more nicely. So I would recommend adding this to your code. And then just to briefly go through what's happening on this page, we've got material design card at the top, which is going to contain our input for our search. And of course the input here, search query, is going to get passed to our search images function, which is bound to a click event on this button. So the field is sort of capturing what the user is inputting, and we're passing that value to our search images function. All right, and then we've got a div here with an ngIf directive on it. And so if you recall, searching was set to false by default. This is what is getting set to true when search images is called while the API request is out. So before it completes, and once it completes, it's getting set back to false. So we use that to hide or show this material design progress bar that we have here. Then we've got a card which is going to contain our images, of course. If they're found, we'll display the results. And this is where our masonry library comes into play here. So we have an ng4 on masonry brick, which is again feeding just this range of images that we have here, applying some of our custom styling here. We are using interpolation to create a link out to the page URL for this image. And here we're binding the user image URL. If we take a look to the style, in other words, we're going to bind the style of a background image. We're going to apply the user image URL for the avatar to this element to show the user's avatar. We are getting the user from the image object, as well as the tags, comments, and number of likes that are on that particular image. So that's pretty much it for the image list component, and yeah, so basically the entire application is kind of bound up in this single component. One thing I forgot to mention is you should head over to your .angular CLI.json file, and we need to add relative paths to the CSS from our Bootstrap installation, so which is in Node modules, Bootstrap, dist, CSS, bootstrap.min.css. We should also apply the relative path to the CSS that comes with our Angular Material theme, and so that's going to clean up the way that our page looks. So let's go ahead and go take a look at what it looks like now. So if I go ahead and type in another search query here, you can see that everything is looking pretty good. And we can click on the images and it takes us over to Pixabay, where we could download them if we want, or check out some related images. So yeah, that's our simple image search application in Angular. I hope you enjoyed the video. We covered kind of a lot here, although it is a relatively simple application. I'd say one of the key components here is using that HTTP class that is part of Angular. It makes it very simple to make HTTP requests, and we just looked at the GET method, but of course we could implement any of the other HTTP verbs, so you could do something very similar to, for example, post if you were going to build maybe build a blog or a forum application or something like that. I also encourage you to explore the Angular Material design library. We just used a few components from that, but there is a lot more to that library, and I think it is a really nice, clean design paradigm, and certainly that library makes it very easy to kind of play around with and get something bootstrapped relatively quickly. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, be sure to leave them below, and I'll do everything I can to answer them. And if you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. So yeah, see you next time.